Her child without shoes, a baby in their arms, and an unlikely promise made in the cold of the night. But what a stranger did in that moment changed everything in a way no one could have foreseen. It was an unusually cold winter night in Portland. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the city, typically cold and quiet, was covered by a fine drizzle that soaked the sidewalks and made the concrete of Madison Avenue seem even more impersonal. In the midst of the fog and hurried movement of cars, a small silhouette stood out. An 8-year-old girl, barefoot, with feet reddened by cold and a face dirty from street dust, carrying a baby wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Beth clutched little Johnny against her chest, trying to protect him from the cutting wind that blew between the buildings. Her 8-month-old brother cried softly, a weak, broken cry that made the girl's heart tighten with anguish. "It's okay, Johnny," she whispered, adjusting the thin blanket around the baby's reddened face. "We'll get some milk soon. Just a little. Longer." Beth looked back toward the storefront awning where she had left her mother. Rose was there, sitting among torn blankets, her gaze lost in emptiness. Since Brian, Johnny's father, had disappeared after months of abuse and humiliation, Rose had never been the same. Her psychotic episodes became more frequent, and in recent days she could barely recognize her own children. The girl took a deep breath and continued her journey. The powdered milk donated by the municipal shelter had run out the night before, and Johnny hadn't eaten for hours. Beth knew she needed to act quickly. With impressive determination for someone so young, she headed toward the convenience store a few blocks away. It was a place she knew well, from the times when her mother still managed to find work as a house cleaner, and they would stop by to buy bread and milk. Beth's bare feet slid in the icy puddles, but she wouldn't allow herself to stop. Johnny's crying was getting weaker, and that frightened her more than the cold or hunger she felt. When she finally spotted the lights of the convenience store, she felt momentary relief. She paused at the entrance, hesitant. Through the foggy glass she could see the clerk, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, organizing products on the shelves. Beth knew she had no money. She knew many shopkeepers had turned her away before. But for Johnny, she was willing to try anything. Upon entering the store, the warmth of the environment contrasted with the cold outside, making her fingers tingle painfully. The clerk, Carl, looked up with visible suspicion. He was already accustomed to homeless children who came in to steal or beg. "What do you want, little girl?" he asked, not hiding his impatience. "If you've come asking for food, we don't have anything to donate today." Beth swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the man's gaze. But there was something about her, a dignity that not even misery could erase, that made her hold her head high even in the most difficult moments. "My little brother needs milk," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her purplish lips. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday and he's getting weak." "Please, mister." Carl sighed, running his hand over his tired face. "I'm sorry, but I can't just give away merchandise. I have bills to pay, you understand? The owner has already complained about my donations." It was at that moment that Beth did something unexpected. She carefully placed Johnny on the counter, adjusted her posture, and looked directly into the clerk's eyes. "I promise I'll pay," she said, with a seriousness that didn't match her age. "I swear by everything sacred that when I grow up, I'll come back here and pay every cent. I'll study, work, and one day I'll pay you for everything. That's a grown-up promise." Carl was speechless in the face of that declaration. There was a strength in that child that disconcerted him. Before he could respond, however, a deep voice sounded behind them. "I'll pay." Beth turned quickly, startled. Standing at the store's entrance was a tall man, approximately 45 years old, wearing a dark overcoat that seemed too expensive for that neighborhood. He had an angular face, marked by lines of expression that spoke of deep concerns, but his brown eyes conveyed an unexpected kindness. "I'll pay for what the girl needs," he repeated, approaching the counter and taking his wallet from the inside pocket of his coat. Beth observed the stranger with suspicion. From an early age, she had learned that favors rarely came without a price. The man seemed to notice her wariness and smiled slightly. "My name is Edward Miller," he introduced himself, bending a little to be at Beth's height. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to help." There was something in his voice, a sincerity, that Beth, with her intuition sharpened by life on the streets, recognized as genuine. Even so, she remained cautious. "What does the baby need?" asked Edward, turning to Carl. "Powdered milk, diapers," began the clerk, looking at Beth as if asking for confirmation. "And medicine for his fever," added the girl, touching her brother's hot forehead. "He's burning up." Edward nodded and asked Carl to gather everything necessary. While the clerk collected the items, the man turned to Beth. "Where is your mother?" he asked, careful not to sound invasive. "Under the awning near the viaduct," replied Beth after a moment of hesitation. "She's not well. She can't understand things right." Edward nodded again, without asking more questions. Something about that child touched him deeply. It was as if at that moment something dormant inside him began to awaken. After paying for everything Carl had gathered, Edward offered to carry the bags and accompany Beth to where her mother was. The girl accepted but remained alert during the entire journey, always a few steps ahead, as if ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. When they reached the awning, the scene they found tightened Edward's heart. Rose was huddled among filthy blankets, mumbling disconnected words to herself. Seeing strangers approaching, her eyes widened in panic, and she tried to get up abruptly. "It's okay, Mom," said Beth, running to hold her trembling hands. "He just brought milk for Johnny. He won't hurt us?" Rose looked suspiciously at Edward, protectively hugging her daughter against herself. Despite her fragile mental condition, her maternal instinct remained intact. "Who are you?" she asked, with a hoarse and defensive voice. "What do you want with my children?" Edward kept his distance, respecting the space of that family devastated by poverty and abandonment. "I'm Edward Miller," he answered, placing the bags on the wet ground within their reach. "I found your daughter in the store trying to get milk for the baby. I just wanted to help." Rose continued to stare at him with suspicion, but her posture relaxed a bit when Beth began preparing the milk for Johnny, using water from a plastic bottle they kept with them. Edward observed the scene with a lump in his throat. The skill with which Beth cared for her brother, the way she tried to calm her mother, everything indicated a maturity forced by circumstances, a childhood stolen by the necessity of survival. "It's very cold for you to stay here," he said finally. I can pay for a hotel room for you to spend the night, just until the weather improves." Rose immediately closed her expression, suspicious of the intentions of this well-dressed stranger. "We don't need charity," she responded harshly. "We know how to manage." Edward was about to respond, but Beth intervened, surprising them both. "It's for Johnny, Mom," she said with frightening maturity. "He could get very sick if he spends another night in the cold, please." The pleading look from the girl broke Rose's resistance. Reluctantly she nodded, but made it clear that it would be just for one night. Edward breathed a sigh of relief. It was a start. While helping the family gather the few possessions they had, Edward felt something awakening within him. Something that had been dormant since the loss of Eliza, his wife. It was as if that promise made by a barefoot child in the middle of the night, "I swear I'll pay when I grow up," had rekindled a flame that he believed was extinguished forever. Edward watched through the taxi window as they crossed the city toward the Riverview Hotel, a discreet but comfortable establishment in downtown Portland. Beside him, Beth firmly held her brother, as if fearing someone might snatch him from her arms at any moment. In the front seat, Rose kept her gaze fixed on the road, tense and silent. Edward's mind wandered through long-stored memories. 5 years ago, his life was completely different. He lived with Eliza, his wife, in a luxurious penthouse in Nob Hill. He worked as a financial director for a multinational company, and they were planning to have children. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Eliza felt a severe headache. The following week brought the diagnosis, cerebral aneurysm. 3 months later, she was gone, taking with her all the dreams they had built together. Edward immersed himself in work until he became a majority partner in the company. He accumulated fortune but lived in an existential void that no material goods could fill. In recent years, he rarely left home beyond what was necessary for work. His routine was predictable and empty. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. That night, however, something inexplicable had impelled him to go out for a walk under the fine drizzle. It was as if an invisible force had guided him to that convenience store at the exact moment when Beth was making her determined promise. "We've arrived," announced the driver, interrupting his thoughts. The hotel wasn't luxurious, but it offered clean, heated rooms. Edward had chosen a place where they wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about that strange family. After checking in and paying for 2 nights, not just one as he had initially promised, he accompanied them to a simple but cozy room with 2 twin beds and a crib that he had specially requested. "There's a hot shower," he explained, pointing to the bathroom door. "And I've asked for some clean clothes to be brought. They should arrive soon." Beth looked at everything with wide eyes, as if she were in a magical place. Rose, on the other hand, remained defensive, like a wounded animal fearing a trap. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked when Beth went to examine the bathroom, still carrying Johnny. "What do you want from us?" Edward sat on the edge of one of the beds, maintaining a respectful distance from Rose. "I've been lost too," he answered with sincerity. "In a different way, but I've been lost too. Sometimes we need someone to extend a hand without asking. Questions." Rose studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a complex enigma. "We have no way to pay," she said, with a remnant of pride in her tired voice. Edward smiled slightly. "Your daughter already promised me she'll pay when she grows up. I trust her word." A slight smile, the first since they had met, appeared on Rose's face. It was a sad smile, but one that revealed the woman who existed behind the hardened facade. "Curve suffering. Beth has always been like that," she commented softly. "Too responsible for her age. Sometimes I forget she's only 8 years old." At that moment, Beth returned from the bathroom, still carrying her brother. "Mom, there's real hot water," she exclaimed, with childish enthusiasm that contrasted with her usual maturity. "Can we give Johnny a bath? He's so dirty." Rose nodded, getting up to help her daughter. Edward took the opportunity to say goodbye, promising to return the next day to see how they were doing. Before leaving, he left his phone number written on the hotel's notepad. "If you need anything, at any time you can call me," he said, addressing primarily Beth, who seemed to be the pillar of that fragmented family. "Thank you, Uncle Edward," replied the girl, surprising him with the familiar treatment. As he left the hotel and entered the waiting taxi again, Edward felt something strange in his chest. A sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. In the hotel room, after bathing Johnny and feeding him properly for the first time in days, Beth and Rose also took hot showers. The clean clothes that Edward had provided, simple outfits but new and warm, seemed an unimaginable luxury after so much time living on the streets. With full stomachs and warmed bodies, Rose sat on the bed, watching Johnny sleep peacefully in the improvised crib. Beth, exhausted but happy, lay down beside her mother. "Do you think he'll really come back tomorrow?" asked the girl, referring to Edward. Rose hesitated. Life had taught her not to trust promises, especially those coming from strangers. Brian, Johnny's father, had also made many promises before showing his true violent nature. "I don't know, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "But even if he doesn't come back, he's already done a lot for us today." Beth was silent for a moment, thoughtful. "He'll come back," she affirmed, with the unshakable certainty of children. "He has sad eyes like yours, Mom. I think he's lonely, too." Rose felt a lump in her throat at her daughter's sharp perception. In her moments of lucidity, like now, she could see with painful clarity how much she had failed as a mother, how much Beth had been forced to grow up before her time to compensate for her mental absences. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she murmured, caressing Beth's damp hair, "for everything." The girl just smiled and snuggled closer to her mother, enjoying a rare moment of connection. The next morning, Edward returned as promised, bringing a complete breakfast and more clothes and diapers for Johnny. He found Rose calmer, her eyes less haunted after a night of restorative sleep. Beth, in turn, radiated renewed energy, chattering about how her little brother had slept through the night without crying. While they ate, Edward observed the interaction between them. There were moments when Rose seemed to disconnect, her gaze losing focus, her hands trembling slightly. In these instances, Beth naturally took control, serving more juice to her mother or adjusting Johnny in her lap. "Rose," called Edward gently when they finished eating. "May I talk to you about something important?" She nodded, suspicious. Edward continued, "I have a small apartment in the Richmond district. It was my grandmother's. It's been empty for years, fully furnished. If you want, you can stay there. For a while. Until you get organized." The silence that followed his proposal was dense. Rose looked at him as if trying to see some hidden trap. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why are you doing all this for us? We're strangers." Edward reflected for a moment before answering. "Because when I lost my wife, I closed myself off from the world. I stopped living. Yesterday, when I saw Beth making that promise, something woke up in me." He paused, searching for the right words. "Maybe I need you as much as you need me." The raw honesty of that confession disarmed Rose. There was still distrust in her eyes, but also something new, understanding. "We don't want charity," she said firmly. It was Beth who intervened, as she had done the night before. "We can pay later," she declared seriously. "When I grow up and become a famous writer, I'll pay for everything with interest." Edward couldn't contain a smile at the girl's determination. "Is it a deal, then?" he asked, extending his hand first to Beth and then to Rose. After a moment of hesitation, both shook his hand, sealing a pact that would forever change the lives of all four. That same afternoon, Edward took them to see the apartment. It was a modest property, but cozy, in an old, well-preserved building. 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, and a small office that could be adapted as a room for Johnny when he grew up. The furniture was simple but of good quality, preserved, by the time the place had remained closed. "It belonged to my grandmother Olivia," explained Edward, as he opened the windows to air out the space. "She loved this place. She used to say the walls had stories to tell." Beth ran from one room to another, enchanted with the space. For someone who had lived between awnings and viaducts, that apartment was a palace. Rose walked more slowly, touching the furniture as if she feared breaking it, still processing the sudden change in their lives. "There's a public school 2 blocks from here," commented Edward, watching Beth explore the small office. "We can see about enrolling you there. What do you think?" The girl's eyes lit up with excitement. She had always dreamed of attending a real school, having notebooks, colored pencils, learning to write stories. "Can I really?" she asked, hardly believing it. "Of course you can," replied Edward, smiling at her enthusiasm. "And your mother, Rose, if you want, I know a very good psychologist. She could help with—" He didn't complete the sentence, uncertain about how to address Rose's mental condition without seeming invasive. To his surprise, she wasn't offended. "Thank you," she said simply. I know I need help. For my children." That admission, so sincere and vulnerable, touched Edward deeply. He understood at that moment that behind the fear and distrust, there was a woman desperately fighting to reconnect with the world, out of love for her children. The next day, while helping Rose organize the apartment, Edward noticed a subtle change in her. There was more clarity in her gaze, as if the security of a roof and the hope of proper treatment were already having an effect. "Brian might show up," she said suddenly, while folding the new clothes Edward had bought for them. "He always appears when things start to get better." Edward sat at the kitchen table, inviting her to do the same. "Who is Brian?" he asked carefully. "Johnny's father," replied Rose, her voice hardening. He's not a good person. He hurt us a lot." Edward nodded without pressing for details he knew were painful. "If he appears, we'll deal with it," he assured. "You're not alone anymore." Rose stared at him for a long time, as if trying to believe those words. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, she extended her hand and lightly touched Edward's. "Thank you," she said with simplicity, "for everything." That small gesture, so simple and at the same time so significant, marked the true beginning of the journey that would unite those 4 very different lives. A journey that had begun with a promise made by a child on a cold winter night in Portland. 2 weeks had passed since the move to the apartment in the Richmond district. The lives of Beth, Johnny, and Rose were gradually transforming, like a plant that, after a long time in the shade, finally finds sunlight. Beth had started her studies at Washington Elementary School, 2 blocks from the apartment. On the first day, Edward personally accompanied her, proudly carrying the new backpack they had bought together. The principal, Mrs. Martha, a woman with a severe expression but kind eyes, received them in her office. "Beth has never regularly attended school," explained Edward, while the girl observed, fascinated, the maps and books that decorated the walls of the office. "But she's extremely intelligent and learns quickly." Mrs. Martha smiled, noticing the gleam in the child's eyes as she leafed through a storybook that was on the desk. "Do you like to read, Beth?" she asked gently. "I don't know how to read properly yet," confessed the girl, blushing slightly, "but I like to make up stories by looking at the pictures, and Uncle Edward is teaching me the letters." The principal exchanged a significant look with Edward. An 8-year-old child who couldn't read indicated serious educational gaps. However, Beth's enthusiasm was evident. "We'll place her in 1st grade initially," decided Mrs. Martha, "with remedial classes after school. If she progresses as we expect, she could advance to her age-appropriate class later this year." Edward nodded, grateful for the understanding. When they left the office to see the classroom, Beth held his hand tightly, a mixture of excitement and nervousness on her small face. "What if the other children laugh at me?" she whispered, "because I can't read like them?" Edward crouched, down to her height, adjusting the colorful hair clip that held her newly cut hair. "Remember what we talked about? Everyone has different stories. You have knowledge that many children don't have, and you'll learn quickly, I'm sure." Beth took a deep breath and nodded, raising her chin in a gesture of determination that Edward already knew well. "I'll be the best student in the school," she declared. "That's a promise." Meanwhile, at the apartment, Rose was beginning her psychological treatment with Dr. Teresa, a therapist recommended by Edward. The first sessions were difficult, reliving traumas, facing memory lapses, accepting the need for medication to stabilize her condition. But gradually, like a nebula dissipating, her mind began to find clarity. "I have nightmares about Brian," she confessed to Dr. Teresa during a particularly intense session. "I see him taking Johnny away, hurting Beth, and I can't do anything to stop it." The therapist listened attentively, helping Rose process the fears that paralyzed her. "Fear protects us from real dangers, but it can also imprison us in imaginary ones," explained Dr. Teresa. "Brian hurt you in the past, and it's natural to fear he might return. But now you have a support network, you're seeking treatment, and that makes all the difference." Rose reflected on these words in the days that followed. It was true that her situation had changed drastically. The apartment offered security, Johnny was gaining weight and smiling more each day, and Beth finally had the chance to be a child. On a sunny September afternoon, Edward visited the apartment, bringing children's books for Beth and a new educational toy for Johnny. He found Rose in the kitchen, preparing a simple cake, her hair tied in an unpretentious ponytail, wearing modest clothes but clean and well kept. It was an image that strongly contrasted with the fragile woman he had met weeks before. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, smiling as he felt the sweet aroma that filled the environment. "Not at all," she replied, drying her hands on the apron. "Actually, I was thinking of calling you. I wanted to talk about something important." Edward sat at the kitchen table, intrigued by Rose's serious tone. She served coffee for both before continuing. "I want to work," she said finally, staring at the steaming cup. "I can't depend on you forever. I need to support my children." Edward nodded, understanding the importance of that desire. It wasn't just a financial matter, but one of self-esteem and independence. "I think it's a great idea. What do you have in mind for work?" Before everything went wrong, I was a kitchen assistant in a restaurant," she explained. "I always liked cooking. Maybe I could go back to doing that part-time for now while Beth is in school. Dr. Teresa thinks it would be good for me to have a routine, a responsibility beyond the children." "I know the owner of Southern Comfort nearby," commented Edward thoughtfully. Ted is a good man. He's always in need of help in the kitchen. I can talk to him if you'd like. Rose's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and hesitation. I don't want you to think I'm being ungrateful for everything you've done for us, she said softly. But I need to feel useful again. Edward extended his hand across the table, lightly touching hers in a gesture of understanding. Rose, helping you was never about creating dependency. It was about giving you a chance to rebuild your lives. Seeing you want to work, seeing Beth excited about school, seeing Johnny growing healthy, that's all I could wish for. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Beth came running in, her face lit up by contagious excitement, holding a colorful paper. Mom, Uncle Edward, look what I made at school today. It was a drawing made with crayons, representing 4 figures holding hands, a woman, a man, a girl, and a baby. Above them, in large, slightly crooked letters, was written, My Family. Edward felt a lump in his throat when he realized he was included in that representation. It's beautiful, honey, said Rose, hugging the girl affectionately. Let's put it on the refrigerator for everyone to see. While Beth chattered about her day at school, about how the teacher had praised her for learning the letters quickly, and how she had made a new friend named Julie, Edward observed the scene with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of joy and apprehension. Without realizing it, he was becoming attached to that improvised family, and that frightened him. That night, after dining with them and helping put Johnny to bed, the baby already recognized him and always smiled when he saw him, Edward drove back to his penthouse in Nob Hill. The contrast between the two places was striking. The Richmond district apartment, modest but full of life and laughter, and his luxurious penthouse, impeccably decorated, but cold and silent. For the first time in years, the solitude of his house deeply bothered him. He walked to the office, where a photograph of Eliza still occupied a prominent place on the desk. He touched the frame with reverence, as he did every night. I think I'm getting into something complicated, Eliza, he murmured to the smiling image of his wife. But I also think you would approve. You always said I needed to open my heart. How to the world again. The following days brought new developments. Rose got the job at Southern Comfort, working from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., while Beth was in school. Johnny was cared for by Mrs. Judy, a retired neighbor who loved children and offered to help in exchange for a small payment. The established routine brought stability for everyone. Beth advanced in her studies with impressive speed, compensating for the years without formal education with extraordinary dedication. In just 1 month, she was already able to read small texts, to the pride of her teacher and Edward, who spent hours helping her with homework. I want to write my own stories someday, she confided to Edward one afternoon when they were studying together at the kitchen table. Stories about children who overcome difficulties, like in the books you gave me. Edward smiled, moved by the girl's determination. I'm sure you'll be a great writer, he replied, and I'll be your first reader. Rose was also blossoming. The work at the restaurant gave her purpose, and gradually she regained confidence in herself. Her episodes decreased, and when they occurred, she was already able to recognize the signs and seek help before they worsened. The medication helped maintain her mood stable, and the sessions with Dr. Teresa allowed her to process her traumas little by little. One night after putting the children to bed, Rose invited Edward to stay a little longer. They sat on the small balcony of the apartment, sharing a cup of chamomile tea while observing the city lights. I never properly thanked you, she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. For all of this. Edward shook his head, embarrassed. You don't need to thank me. Seeing you rebuilding your lives is gratification enough. Rose studied him for a moment, as if really seeing him for the first time. Who are you, Edward Miller? She asked, with genuine curiosity. Where does all this kindness come from? Edward sighed, realizing that in all those weeks he had talked very little about himself. I'm just someone who lost a lot and learned the hard way that life is made of connections, he replied, staring at the horizon. My wife, Eliza, passed away 5 years ago. Cerebral aneurysm. It was too sudden. We didn't have a chance to say goodbye. After that, I closed myself off from the world. I worked obsessively, accumulated money, but lived in a void. Rose listened in silence, her face revealing understanding. Then you found Beth in that store, she completed softly. Then I found Beth, he agreed with a melancholic smile. And that promise of hers, I'll pay when I grow up. Something in those words broke a barrier inside me, as if suddenly the future existed again, the possibility of seeing someone grow, develop. Like the child you and Eliza planned to have, concluded Rose with an intuition that surprised him. Edward nodded, unable to speak for a moment, moved by the accuracy of that observation. Rose, with delicacy, covered his hand with hers. We're all broken in some way, Edward. You helped us glue our pieces back together. Maybe we're helping you glue yours together too. That conversation marked a subtle change in the dynamic between them. A new intimacy, based on mutual understanding of deep pain and shared hope for healing. As October arrived, bringing warmer and more colorful days to Portland, the small apartment in the Richmond district became more and more a true home. The walls, once empty, now displayed Beth's drawings, photographs of the four of them together on an outing to the botanical gardens, and even a handprint of Johnny made with finger paint. Spring in Portland brought flowers to the garden beds and renewed air to the city. In the Richmond district apartment, Johnny was taking his first steps, wobbly and unsure, under the proud gazes of Rose, Beth, and Edward. The baby, who had recently turned one, looked nothing like the fragile, undernourished child of months ago. Now he had chubby cheeks, bright eyes, and a contagious laugh that lit up the room. "Come to Mummy, my love," called Rose, crouched a few steps away from him, arms extended in invitation. Johnny wobbled, determined, taking 3 unsteady steps, before falling on his bottom, laughing as if he had made the biggest mischief in the world. "He's almost got it," exclaimed Beth, sitting on the floor next to her brother. "Go, Johnny, go to Ed." Edward smiled, hearing the affectionate nickname the baby had given him. Ed was one of Johnny's first words, a childish attempt to say Edward that had stuck. At first, Edward had been surprised by the intimacy of that nickname, but soon embraced it with barely disguised emotion. "Come to Ed, champion," he encouraged, kneeling beside Rose. The baby smiled, showing his few little teeth, and tried to stand up again. This time he managed 5 steps before falling into Edward's arms, who lifted him into the air with genuine joy. "That's it. You did it." Rose watched the scene with moist eyes. The naturalness with which Edward interacted with her children, the genuine affection he showed, all of this awakened conflicting feelings in her. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more, something she wouldn't allow herself to name. Life had improved considerably in recent months. Rose now worked full-time at Southern Comfort, where the owner, Ted, had recognized her talent in the kitchen and promoted her to assistant chef. Beth had been transferred to 2nd grade, quickly adapting to the new academic challenge. Her passion for reading and writing grew each day, as did her collection of notebooks where she wrote down small stories and poems. Edward remained present, but respected the space and independence that the family was gaining. He visited them regularly, took the children on outings on Sundays, and was always available when they needed him. At the same time, he maintained a respectful distance, aware that his role in that family was not clearly defined. Her father wasn't a husband, but also wasn't just a distant benefactor. On that sunny October afternoon, while Johnny rested after the excitement of his first steps, Edward was helping Beth with an essay for school. The theme was "My Biggest Dream," and the girl was writing enthusiastically about her desire to become a writer. "When I grow up," she read aloud, "I want to write stories that make people believe there is always hope, even in the darkest moments. I want my stories to be like stars in the dark sky, showing the way for those who are lost." Edward listened, amazed by the sensitivity and maturity of that 9-year-old child. When she finished reading, he applauded softly. "It's beautiful. Beth, your teacher will love it." The girl smiled, proud, but soon her expression changed to a more serious one. "Uncle Edward, can I ask you something?" "Of course, what is it?" Beth hesitated, nervously playing with the pencil between her fingers. "Why do you never bring your friends here, or your family? Do you have siblings, parents? No one ever comes to visit you." The question caught Edward by surprise. He rarely talked about his personal life, even after so many months of living together. "Well," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I have a sister, Beatrice. By coincidence, she has the same name as you. She lives in New York with her family. My parents passed away many years ago, and as for friends, I think I drifted away from many of them after Eliza left." "Do you feel lonely?" insisted Beth with the honest curiosity of children. Edward reflected for a moment before answering. "Before I met you, yes, I felt very lonely. Now, not so much." The answer seemed to satisfy Beth, who turned her attention back to her essay. But the question kept echoing in Edward's mind, leading him to reflect on how his life had changed since that cold winter night. Later, while helping Rose prepare dinner, Edward mentioned the conversation with Beth. "She has a unique way of getting right to the point," he commented, cutting vegetables for the salad. Rose smiled, stirring a sauce on the stove. "Beth has always been like that, observant. Sometimes I think she sees things that even we adults can't see." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "She asked me about my family, my friends, made me realize how much I've isolated myself in recent years. Maybe it's time to reconnect with some people." "Your sister," suggested Rose. "You said she has the same name as Beth. Are you close?" "We were," replied Edward with a sigh. "After Eliza passed away, Beatrice tried to get close to help me, but I pushed her away. Like I pushed everyone away. She still sends messages on birthdays and important dates, but it's been almost 2 years since we've seen each other in person." "You should call her," said Rose simply. "Life is too short to stay away from those we love." There was a deep wisdom in those words, born from Rose's own painful experiences. Edward looked at her with admiration, impressed by the strength she showed after everything she had lived through. Dinner proceeded with the usual joy. Beth talked about her day at school. Johnny babbled his first words sitting in his high chair, and Edward felt at home in a way that his luxurious penthouse had never provided. It was in the midst of this domestic harmony that the phone rang. Rose answered, and her face immediately paled. Edward noticed the change and approached, concerned. "Who was it?" he asked, when Rose hung up, visibly shaken. "Brian," she replied, her voice almost inaudible. "He's back. He wants to see Johnny. Tomorrow." The name fell like a bomb in the peaceful environment. Beth, who had heard the conversation, instinctively hugged her brother as if wanting to protect him. "He can't take Johnny away, can he, Mum?" asked the girl, with evident fear in her voice. Rose took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for her children. "No, sweetheart, no one is going to take your brother anywhere." Edward remained silent, processing the information. He knew from fragments of conversations over the months that Brian had been violent with Rose, that their relationship had been marked by physical and psychological abuse. He also knew that, legally, as Johnny's biological father, Brian had rights that couldn't simply be ignored. "What do you want to do?" he finally asked Rose. She ran her hand through her hair in a nervous gesture. "I don't know. He's the father. He has the right to see his son. But I'm afraid, Edward. Afraid of what he might do, what he might say. You don't have to face him alone," assured Edward. "I can be with you when he comes if you want." Rose nodded, grateful for the support. That night was sleepless for everyone. Edward ended up sleeping on the couch at Beth's request, who felt safer with him around. The girl vividly remembered the times Brian had yelled at her mother, the purple marks he had left, the terror he had brought into their lives. The next morning, promptly at 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Rose, who had sent Beth to the house of Julie, her best friend from school, adjusted Johnny in her arms and took a deep breath before opening the door. Brian was different from what Edward had imagined. He didn't have the appearance of a monster, but of an ordinary man, of medium height with eyes identical to Johnny's. He dressed with simplicity but with care, as if he wanted to make a good impression. "Rose," he greeted her, with a contained nod, before directing his gaze to Edward. "And you must be the new friend." There was a clear insinuation in those words, a subtle venom that Edward chose to ignore. "Edward Miller," he introduced himself, extending his hand formally. "A family friend, yes." Brian ignored the extended hand, focusing his attention on Johnny, who looked at the stranger with curiosity. "My son has grown," he commented, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I hold him?" Rose hesitated but handed the baby to his biological father, remaining alert. Johnny, always sociable, didn't find Brian strange, but also didn't show the enthusiasm he usually had with familiar people. "He's well cared for," observed Brian, analyzing the apartment with a critical eye. "I see you've found a good protector." The comment, loaded with sarcasm, made Rose stiffen. "What do you want, Brian?" she asked directly. "Why come back now after so long?" Brian returned Johnny to his mother's arms before answering. "I'm different, Rose. I've had treatment. I'm working as a ride-share driver. I have a small but decent apartment." He paused as if pondering his next words. "I want to be part of my son's life. I have that right." "Right?" repeated Rose with disbelief. "What right does a man have who abandoned his newborn son, who left his own family living on the street?" Brian sighed, apparently regretful. "I know I made mistakes, penny mistakes, but I want to fix things. I'm not asking to get back with you. I know that ship has sailed. I just want to know my son, to be a father to him." Edward observed the interaction in silence, respecting Rose's space to deal with her, past but attentive to any sign of threat. "How can I trust you?" asked Rose, her voice trembling slightly. "After everything?" "You can't," replied Brian with surprising honesty. "Not immediately, but we can start slowly. Supervised visits, maybe. I just want a chance, Rose." The sincerity in Brian's voice was disconcerting. Rose looked at Edward, as if seeking advice. He nodded slightly, signaling support, whatever her decision. "1 visit per week," she said, finally. "Here at the apartment with my presence. We'll see how things progress from there." Brian agreed, seeming genuinely grateful for the opportunity. Before leaving, however, he cast a final look at Edward. "Thank you for taking care of them when I couldn't," he said, in a tone that mixed gratitude and challenge. "But I'm back now, and I'm going to take on my responsibilities." After Brian's departure, Rose collapsed on the couch, emotionally exhausted. "Do you think he's really changed?" she asked Edward, while Johnny played peacefully on the rug. "I don't know him well enough to say," he replied honestly, "but I believe he took the first right step by accepting the conditions you imposed. Time will tell if the change is genuine." Rose nodded, thoughtful. "I'm afraid, Edward, not just of what he might do, but of what his presence might mean for our dynamic." Edward understood what she wasn't saying. In recent months, they had formed a kind of unconventional family. Edward occupied a space that biologically belonged to Brian. The return of Johnny's father threatened not only the emotional security they had built, but also the feelings that were beginning to bloom between him and Rose. "I'm here," he assured, her holding her hands firmly. "No matter what happens, I won't abandon you." That night, when Beth returned from her friend's house and learned of Brian's visit, her reaction was one of fear and indignation. "He'll try to take Johnny from us," she declared, categorically, "and he'll make Mom cry again." Edward sat beside her on the bed, while Rose put Johnny to sleep in the room next door. "Your mother is very strong, Beth," he said softly, "and much wiser than she was before. She'll know how to protect you and your brother. And you'll protect us too, won't?" "You, Uncle Edward?" asked the girl with pleading eyes. "Always," he promised, feeling the weight of that word. "I'll always be here for you." But as he said this, Edward couldn't help but wonder what his place would be in that family now that Brian had returned. As much as he wanted to deny it, a shadow of uncertainty hung over the future that, until then, had seemed so clear. November arrived with hot days and sudden afternoon rains, typical of Portland's spring. In the Richmond District apartment, the routine followed its course, now with the addition of Brian's weekly visits, who surprisingly kept within the limits established by Rose. Beth, however, remained steadfast in her distrust. She refused to stay in the same environment as Brian, always finding excuses to visit friends or spend the afternoon at the public library when she knew he would come. Edward respected the girl's position, understanding that her memories of her stepfather were very different from those that Johnny, still a baby, might build. On a particularly rainy afternoon, Edward picked up Beth from school, as he occasionally did. The girl was strangely quiet during the journey, watching the rain through the car window with a thoughtful expression. "Is everything okay?" he asked, concerned about her unusual silence. "Did something happen at school?" Beth shook her head, but remained thoughtful. It was only when they parked near the building that she finally spoke. "Uncle Edward, can I ask you a favor?" "Of course, what do you need?" "Can you take me somewhere before we go home? It's important." The seriousness on Beth's face intrigued Edward. She rarely made requests, always concerned about not being a burden, a remnant of the difficult times. "On the streets. Where do you want to go?" "To the city library," she replied. "There's a writing contest that ends today, and I wanted to submit my story." Edward smiled, proud of Beth's interest in writing. "A contest? Why didn't you tell me before? Of course we can go. What kind of story did you write?" Beth looked away, suddenly shy. It's about a promise. It's called A Grown-Up Promise. But it's a surprise. I can't tell you anymore." Edward respected the mystery, driving to the library through Portland's wet streets. There he watched with pride as Beth handed her envelope to the librarian, who received her with a warm smile, already familiar with the girl who frequented the place several times a week. On the way back home, Edward noticed that Beth seemed lighter, as if she had taken a weight off her shoulders. "When do the contest results come out?" he asked, curious. "In December, before Christmas," replied Beth, now animated. "Mrs. Mary helped me revise it, but the idea was all mine. She said I have a chance to win." "I don't doubt it at all," commented Edward, smiling at the girls. Enthusiasm. "You have a gift for storytelling." When they arrived at the apartment, they found Rose in the kitchen, preparing dinner while Johnny played in the playpen installed in a corner of the living room. The baby, now just over a year old, was already walking with ease and trying to speak simple words. "Ed!" he exclaimed upon seeing Edward, stretching his little arms to be picked up. Edward promptly obliged, lifting the boy and making him spin in the air, provoking delicious giggles. Rose watched the scene with a smile, but Edward noticed a shadow of concern in her eyes. "Did something happen?" he asked softly, when Beth went to her room to put away her backpack. Rose sighed, stirring the sauce she was preparing. "Brian. He wants to take Johnny to spend a Sunday with him. He said we've been doing these supervised visits for almost a month now, and it's time to move forward." Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Although Brian had indeed behaved appropriately in recent weeks, the idea of Johnny spending an entire day alone with him triggered an instinctive alarm. "What did you reply?" "I said I needed to think," replied Rose, turning off the stove and turning to him. "On one hand, he's the father, Edward. He's been making an effort, brings presents, plays with Johnny. On the other—" She hesitated, searching for the right. "On the other hand, I can't fully trust him. I still have nightmares about what we went through." Edward nodded, understanding. He put Johnny back in the playpen before continuing. "Have you talked to Dr. Teresa about this?" "Yes, in the last session. She said I need to separate my personal traumas with Brian from his relationship with his son, that I need to make decisions based on the present, not the past." Rose ran her hand over her face, tired. "But it's difficult." "Edward, I'm afraid." He approached, gently holding her shoulders. "Your intuition is important, Rose. If you don't feel comfortable, maybe it's too soon. You could start with a few hours, not a whole day." She agreed, seeming relieved to have someone with whom to share these difficult decisions. Without thinking, she leaned in and kissed Edward's cheek, a simple gesture of gratitude that nevertheless sent an electric current through both their bodies. They moved apart, slightly embarrassed, when they heard Beth returning to the living room. The girl looked from one to the other, with that perceptive gaze that seemed to see beyond appearances. "You two look like you're up to something," she commented, amused, breaking the tension of the moment. The following days passed with a relative normality. Rose decided to allow Brian to take Johnny for an outing of a few hours on Sunday, not the whole day as he wanted, but a start. Edward offered to stay at the apartment during this time to give moral support to Rose and Beth. "I don't need you to be my babysitter," protested Beth when she learned of the plan. "I'm already grown up, almost 10 years old." "I know you are," replied Edward seriously, So grown up that you make grown-up promises, right? The girl blushed at hearing the reference to her story for the contest, but smiled, recognizing the truth in those words. On the agreed Sunday, Brian arrived punctually at 1 p.m. to pick up Johnny. The baby, who had already become accustomed to his father's presence, went without resistance, waving cheerfully to his mother, sister, and Edward as he left. "I'll bring him back at 5 p.m. without fail," guaranteed Brian, adjusting the bag with his son's belongings. There was a gleam of victory in his eyes that bothered Edward. As soon as the door closed, Rose collapsed on the couch, tense as a violin string. Beth approached, sitting beside her and holding her hand. "Everything will be okay, Mom," she said with surprising maturity. "Johnny is smart, he'll be fine." Edward observed the interaction between mother and daughter, once again impressed by the strength of that girl he had met on a cold winter night, barefoot and desperate to feed her brother. To distract Rose during the long hours of waiting, he suggested they make cookies, an activity that Beth loved and that would keep everyone busy. The afternoon passed between flour, sugar, and light conversations, although the clock seemed to drag. At 5 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. Rose ran to the door, anxious. Brian was there with Johnny in his arms, both smiling. The baby immediately stretched toward his mother, chattering animatedly about his outing in a language that mixed recognizable words and incomprehensible babbling. "He behaved very well," reported Brian, handing the bag to Rose. "I took him to the park. He loved the swings. Then we had ice cream, just a little bit, I promise." Rose nodded, discreetly checking if Johnny was okay. The baby seemed happy and without any sign of discomfort, which calmed her considerably. "Thank you for bringing him back on time," she said formally. Brian nodded, his gaze scanning the apartment until he found Edward, who remained at a respectful distance. "Thank you for the trust," he replied, before addressing Edward. "Can we talk for a minute in private?" The request surprised everyone. Rose cast a worried look at Edward, who nodded reassuringly, before following Brian to the external corridor of the apartment. "What's going on?" asked Edward, as soon as the door closed behind them. Brian studied him for a moment, as if evaluating an adversary. "I want to understand what your role is in this family," he said directly. "You're not a relative. You're not Rose's husband. What exactly do you want with them?" The question, although made in a controlled tone, carried an implicit accusation that irritated Edward. "I'm a friend," he replied simply. "I'm here to support them in whatever they need." "Friend," repeated Brian with skepticism. "Look, I'm not an idiot. I see how you look at Rose, how you behave with the children. You're building a family with them, a family that includes my son." Edward kept his calm, recognizing that a confrontation would only make things worse. "Brian, I'm not trying to take your place as Johnny's father. You have that right, as long as you exercise it responsibly. But Rose and Beth also have the right to safety and stability. And you provide that," concluded Brian with a bitter smile. "The savior of the day, right? The successful businessman who rescues the poor, dysfunctional family." "It's not like that," protested Edward, feeling wronged by the characterization. "They've given me as much as I've given them, maybe more." Brian observed him for a long moment before sighing. "I'll be direct. I'm planning to file a formal request for shared custody. I've already consulted a lawyer. I have stable employment, fixed residence, and I've been clean for almost a year. I have good chances." The declaration fell like a bomb. Edward felt a chill in his stomach, imagining the impact this would have on Rose, on Beth, on the fragile stability they had built. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled. "Because I want you to know that I'm serious about being a father to my son," replied Brian. "I'm not going to disappear again, and if that means having to deal with you as part of Johnny's life, then I need to understand exactly who you are to him." Edward nodded slowly, understanding Brian's twisted logic. "I understand your position," he said finally, "but I suggest you talk to Rose about this before taking any legal action. She has worked hard to rebuild her life, to give stability to the children. A legal process would be traumatic for everyone." Brian seemed to consider the words. "I'll think about it," he conceded, before turning to leave. At the last moment, however, he turned again. Just one more thing. Beth, she obviously adores you. And she hates me. She has difficult memories, replied Edward cautiously. I know I wasn't. I wasn't a good stepfather to her. The admission seemed to cost Brian, who looked away as he made it. I'd like to fix that too, if possible. But she won't even stay in the same room as me. Edward felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything. Give her time. Beth is intelligent and observant. If you've really changed, she'll notice. Brian nodded and left, leaving Edward with conflicting thoughts. Upon returning to the apartment, he found Rose anxious for news. What did he want? Edward hesitated, uncertain about how much he should share. He decided on honesty. He's thinking of asking for shared custody of Johnny. Legally. Rose paled, grabbing onto the kitchen counter for support. He can't do that, she murmured. Not after everything. He can't just come back and demand. He hasn't done anything yet, reassured Edward, approaching to support her. It was just a conversation. I suggested he talk to you first, in a civilized manner. Beth, who had heard everything from the hallway, entered the kitchen with a determined expression. He's not going to take Johnny, she declared categorically. I won't let him. Edward and Rose exchanged a worried look. Beth's fierce loyalty was touching, but also potentially problematic. If Brian really filed for custody, any open resistance could complicate the process. Beth, sweetheart, began Rose gently. Johnny is Brian's son. He has legal rights. But he hurt you, protested the girl, her eyes shining with indignation. He yelled at us. He hit you. Have you forgotten? Rose hugged her daughter tightly, feeling the small body tremble with emotion. I haven't forgotten, my love. I will never forget. But people can change, and we have to give Brian a chance to prove if he's really changed. Beth pulled away, incredulous. Are you on his side now? No, sweetheart. I'm on the side of justice. And on the side of what's best for Johnny. The girl looked from Rose to Edward, seeking support. He crouched down to be at her height. Beth, your mother is right. We need to see how things develop. But one thing is certain. We will always be here to protect you and Johnny. That's a promise. The word promise seemed to calm the girl, who nodded reluctantly before retreating to her room. That night, after the children were asleep, Edward and Rose talked at length about the implications of what Brian had revealed. They decided to consult a lawyer the following week to understand what their rights and options would be if he really filed for shared custody. I'm afraid, Edward, confessed Rose as they drank tea on the small balcony. Afraid that he'll succeed, and then disappear again, leaving Johnny confused and hurt. Or worse, afraid that he'll become violent again. Edward held her hand firmly. I won't let anything bad happen to you, he promised. I'll be by your side every step of this process, if he really goes ahead with it. Rose looked at their intertwined hands, and then directly into Edward's eyes. Why? She asked softly. Why do you care so much about us? You've already done more than anyone would do for strangers. Edward reflected for a moment, seeking the most honest answer. Because you gave me back something I had lost, the ability to care, to connect, to feel. He paused, gathering courage. And because I fell in love with you, with this family, with you, Rose. The confession hung between them, delicate and powerful. Rose didn't respond with words, but leaned in slowly and kissed him on the lips. A soft, hesitant kiss, but full of promise. When they separated, both were smiling like teenagers discovering first love. At that moment, despite the uncertainties that the future held, Edward knew he had found his place in the world, beside that strong and resilient woman, and the two children who had thawed his heart. December dressed Portland with colorful lights and Christmas decorations that transformed the serious city into a fairy tale setting. In the Richmond District apartment, Beth and Rose decorated a small Christmas tree, while Johnny, fascinated by the blinking lights, clapped his hands at each ornament placed. Edward observed the scene with a full heart. In recent weeks, his relationship with Rose had deepened, transforming into something that neither of them had planned, but that seemed as natural as the rising of the sun. They still walked slowly. Respecting the traumas of the past and the sensitivity of the children, But there were no longer doubts about the feelings they nurtured for each other. Brian, surprisingly, had not advanced with the request for shared custody. After a frank conversation with Rose, in which she, strengthened by therapy and Edward's support, had managed to express her fears and establish clear boundaries, they had reached an informal agreement. Brian would continue seeing Johnny regularly, at agreed times, with progressively longer visits as trust solidified. "Uncle Edward, this star goes on top," exclaimed Beth, extending a golden ornament. "But I can't reach. Can you help me?" Edward smiled, picking the girl up so she could place the star at the top of the tree herself. When he put her down, Beth didn't release his neck, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, and Edward knew she was thanking him for much more than the simple help with the decoration. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. Rose answered, exchanged a few quick words, and hung up with an intrigued expression. "That was from the city library," she informed. "They said Beth needs to go there tomorrow at 4 o'clock for the closing of the writing contest." Beth's eyes widened. "They didn't say if I won?" "No, sweetheart. They just asked that we be there, preferably with everyone who is important to you." The girl could hardly sleep that night, alternating between the excitement of possibly having won the contest and the fear of disappointment. Edward and Rose tried to prepare her for any outcome, emphasizing that participating was already a great achievement. The next day, Beth's nervousness was contagious. Rose left work early, Edward reorganized important meetings, and even Brian, who was with Johnny that afternoon, was invited to attend in a gesture of conciliation that surprised everyone. At 4 o'clock sharp, they were all at the city library, Beth in the center holding the hands of Rose and Edward, with Brian beside them carrying Johnny. The librarian, Mrs. Helen, received them with a warm smile. "Beth Oliveira?" she asked, consulting a list. Upon receiving confirmation, her smile widened. "We've been waiting for you. The ceremony is about to begin in the auditorium." The small library auditorium was decorated with colorful posters and filled with children of various ages, accompanied by their families. On the improvised stage, a table with certificates and some wrapped packages that appeared to be prizes awaited the winners. Beth squeezed Edward's hand tightly when the library director took the stage to begin the ceremony. There was a brief explanation about the contest, which had received more than 200 essays from schools throughout Portland, divided into 3 categories by age group. "And now we'll announce the winners of the children's category, from 7 to 10 years old," declared the director, raising an envelope. In third place, with the essay "The Robot Who Wanted a Heart," Philip Matthews. A boy of approximately 10 years went up to the stage, receiving enthusiastic applause. Beth began to bite her lip, nervous. In second place, with the essay "The Girl and the Wingless Bird," Mariana Rodriguez. A little girl with colorful braids advanced timidly to receive her certificate. Beth took a deep breath, squeezing the hands of Rose and Edward so tightly that her fingers turned white. "And in first place," continued the director, making a dramatic pause, "with the moving essay "A Grown-Up Promise," Beth Oliveira." For a moment, Beth seemed not to believe what she was hearing. She remained paralyzed until the applause and encouragement from Rose brought her back to reality. With hesitant steps, she went up to the stage, receiving the certificate and a package of new books as a prize. "We would like Beth to read an excerpt from her winning essay for all of us," announced the director, adjusting the microphone to the girl's height. Beth looked at the audience, finding the emotional faces of her improvised family. She took a deep breath and began to read the paper the director handed her. Once upon a time, there was a girl who made a promise on a very cold night. She promised she would pay for a carton of milk when she grew up because her little brother was hungry and she had no money. The promise was too big for such a small girl, but she spoke with such certainty that even the moon, which was peeking through the store window, believed her. What the girl didn't know is that promises are like magic seeds. When we plant a promise, in someone's heart it grows and becomes something much bigger than we imagine. The promise she made that night wasn't just about paying for a carton of milk. It was about honor, about responsibility, about believing that tomorrow can be better than today. A man heard the girl's promise and decided to believe in her. He also had a promise stored inside his heart, the promise he had made to the wife, who had departed, that one day he would smile again, truly live again. The two promises met on that cold night, and from that meeting a family was born. Not a family like others, not a family that came from the same blood or the same name, a family made of kept promises, of second chances, of hands extended in the darkness. The girl's mother, who was lost within herself, found her way back. The little brother, who was weak and sick, grew strong and healthy. The man, who lived alone with his sadness, rediscovered joy. And the girl learned that some promises are worth more than money. They're worth the whole world. Today, the girl hasn't grown enough yet to pay for the milk from that night. But every day she saves a little bit of her joy, her love, her hope to one day give back to the world what she received. Because that's the most important promise, the promise that, no matter how dark the night is, there will always be someone willing to believe in you. And when someone believes in you, you can do anything, even make a grown-up promise. When Beth finished reading, there were tears in many eyes in the audience. Rose was openly crying, and even Brian seemed moved, holding Johnny tighter than necessary. Edward, in turn, felt his heart so full that it seemed about to explode with pride and love for that extraordinary child. After the ceremony, while Beth proudly showed her new books to Johnny, Edward found himself alone with Brian for a moment. "She's amazing," commented Brian, observing his stepdaughter from a distance. "Yes, she is," agreed Edward, unable to disguise his paternal pride. Brian hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for taking care of them when I couldn't, or wouldn't." He paused, visibly uncomfortable with the admission. "Rose told me about the hotel, the apartment, everything you did. You could have just given the milk that night and walked away. Most people would have done that." Edward nodded, surprised by Brian's honesty. "I couldn't walk away," he confessed. "Something in Beth's promise touched me deeply." "I understand that now," said Brian with a sad smile. "After hearing her story, I understand a lot of things." There was a contemplative silence between the two men before Brian continued. I'm not going to file for shared custody, at least not for now. I think Johnny is in good hands, better hands than mine, to be honest." The admission surprised Edward. "That doesn't mean I'm going to disappear," continued Brian quickly. "I want to be part of his life, and maybe in time part of Beth's life too, if she gives me a chance." "I think she will," replied Edward sincerely. "Beth has a huge heart. She just needs to see that you've really changed." Brian nodded, thoughtful, before extending his hand. "Truce, then, for the children's sake." Edward accepted the handshake, sealing an agreement that weeks before would have seemed impossible. The following night, after the children were put to bed, Edward and Rose sat on the balcony of the apartment, contemplating the city lights. Christmas was approaching, bringing with it the promise of a new year, new possibilities. "I found this among Beth's school papers," said Rose, handing Edward an envelope. "It's for you." Intrigued, he opened the envelope, finding inside a colorful drawing. It showed the same family from the previous drawing, the woman, the man, the girl, and the baby. But now they were in front of a house, with a large red heart surrounding them all. At the top, with Beth's still childish but increasingly firm handwriting, was written, "My real family." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "She's amazing," he murmured, unknowingly echoing Brian's words from the day before. "Yes, she is," agreed Rose, leaning in to kiss him softly. "And she's right, you know. We are a family. Different, unconventional, but a family." Edward smiled, holding Rose's hand between his. "I have something to ask you," he said, suddenly serious. "It's not exactly a formal proposal, it's still early for that, but an offer." Rose raised her eyebrows, curious. "My penthouse in Nob Hill is too big for one person. It has 4 bedrooms, an office, a huge balcony." He paused, nervous as a teenager. "What do you think about moving there, all of us? We could transform one of the bedrooms into a special space for Beth to write her stories. Johnny would have a room just for him. And you, well, you would stay wherever you felt most comfortable." Rose observed him for a long moment, a smile slowly forming on her lips. "Are you inviting us to live with you?" Edward nodded, anxious for the answer. "I am. We don't have to decide now. It's just an idea to think about. Brian could continue visiting Johnny normally, maybe even more comfortably. And you?" encouraged Rose when he hesitated. "And I could wake up every day seeing the faces of the three people who brought light back into my life." Rose didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up and extended her hand, inviting him to follow her. They entered silently into the children's room, where Beth and Johnny slept peacefully. The girl had a new book open on her chest, having fallen asleep during reading. The baby hugged a teddy bear that Edward had given him. "Look at them," whispered Rose, her voice choked with emotion. A year ago they were sleeping under a viaduct, cold and hungry. Today they have dreams, they have security, they have love. "This is a miracle, Edward, a miracle that began with a promise on a winter night." She turned to him, her eyes shining with tears and determination. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, we want to live with you. We want to build a life with you. Not because we need a penthouse in Nob Hill, but because we need you. I need you." Edward felt such intense happiness that he could barely breathe. He hugged Rose tightly, as if fearing she might disappear if he let her go. In the small space between the beds, under the soft light of the lamp, they sealed that. Promise with a kiss, not the first, but one that marked the beginning of a new chapter. The next morning, upon waking, Beth found Edward asleep on the living room couch. It wasn't unusual. He frequently stayed late and ended up sleeping there. The girl approached silently, observing the face of the man who had transformed their lives. "Beth," he murmured, opening his eyes slowly. "Good morning, little one." "Good morning, Uncle Edward," she replied, sitting on the edge of the couch. "I had a dream." "Really? About what?" "I dreamed that we were a real family, that you weren't just Uncle Edward anymore, but something more." Edward sat up, now fully awake. "And what would you think of that?" he asked cautiously. "If it wasn't just a dream." Beth smiled, that luminous smile that had captured Edward's heart from the first moment. "I would think that some promises are so big that they don't fit just in our heads. They need to become reality." Edward extended his arms and Beth nestled in them, as if that were her natural place in the world. And perhaps it was. Sometimes families aren't formed by blood or name, but by the promises we make to each other, promises of care, of presence, of unconditional love. Grown up. Promises made by even bigger hearts. On that cold winter night in Portland, when a barefoot girl promised to pay for a carton of milk, she couldn't have imagined that she was planting the seed of a family. That her determination, her courage, her ability to believe in the impossible would transform not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. Because in the end, it wasn't just about paying a debt. It was about recognizing the value of each person, the potential hidden in each heart, the light that can emerge